The courtroom was quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your skin, heavy and impossible to ignore. My father's voice cut through it, calm but sharp, accusing me of things I had never done. Everyone stared, some with disbelief, some with expectation. But no one looked at the documents I had brought, the records that proved the opposite. I sat still, hands folded, letting the weight of the room settle over me. They all assumed I was fragile, dismissed, easy to shake. Even the judge, I realized, was waiting for me to break. And yet, behind every whispered assumption, every sidelong glance, I understood something they didn't. The truth had a way of being patient. I woke before anyone else, as I always did, though I could never say why. The quiet was mine alone in those first minutes, the hum of the heater, the soft scrape of a spoon against my coffee mug, the distant traffic beyond the windows. I moved carefully, not to disturb the house that seemed so alive even when everyone else slept. My father's study door was closed, a thin veil between us, but I had no reason to peer inside. Trust had always been simple, even unquestioning. I made my routine precise: coffee, notes for the day, checking emails, quietly observing. I never liked interruptions, and they rarely came. The first words of the morning were never mine. My mother called from the kitchen, her voice soft but measured. "Breakfast is ready," she said, and I moved toward it, nodding without a word. I didn't have to. We had lived together long enough that her gestures, her tone, even her silences carried meaning. I had learned early that people reveal themselves quietly in the spaces between words. My father was already at the table when I arrived. He didn't look up immediately, eyes fixed on his newspaper. I poured my coffee and sat, careful not to startle him. Trust, I had realized, was often shown in these small, unspoken agreements. He didn't ask me to sit. I didn't ask him to notice me. And yet, in our shared silences, there was a rhythm that had lasted years. "Good morning," I said softly. He grunted in acknowledgement. It was enough. I didn't need more than acknowledgement. I had learned to carry my own presence. Conversation was a tool I wielded selectively, and early in the day, I preferred observation. He turned a page, his expression unreadable, and I traced the light through the blinds. The world outside was beginning its slow stir, but inside the house held its quiet order. Later, I moved to my study. I preferred to work alone, always had. Documents, schedules, letters, and receipts lined the desk, organized not for anyone else's understanding but for mine. I trusted the systems I built. They were predictable, silent witnesses to my existence. There was power in order, in structure, in knowing the movements of those around me without needing to intervene. I was rarely questioned, rarely, if ever, contradicted. People assumed I was gentle, perhaps naive, perhaps too restrained to notice much at all. That was their mistake. By mid-morning, my father would emerge, checking his watch, muttering about appointments and obligations. I didn't interfere, didn't challenge. My routine allowed me to watch him, to notice the small inconsistencies in his speech, the tension in his hands when he thought no one was watching. I had learned early that observation was its own kind of protection. People reveal themselves in the tiniest ways: a hesitation before a sentence, a glance that lingers too long, a document left unguarded. All of it spoke, and I listened. Trust in my house had always been measured. I trusted that my father would not read my private letters, that my mother would not pry unnecessarily. I trusted the systems around me. The way schedules were maintained, the way meetings were recorded, the way our family routines followed the same rhythm year after year. And in return, I was dismissed. I was underestimated. My quiet presence, my careful attention, made me almost invisible. People assumed I noticed little. They assumed I acted gently because I was weak. I had learned to accept that. It was only later that I realized that trust is not always reciprocal. That morning, as I sorted papers and checked schedules, I had no idea how fragile it was, how easily it could be broken. I had no reason to doubt, no signs pointing toward betrayal. My world was stable, familiar, restrained, and predictable. I had faith in the patterns, in the people, in the silence that carried meaning. And yet, beneath the calm surface, I knew, I had always known, that any disturbance, any small misstep could shatter everything. The coffee cooled in its mug unnoticed. The hum of the heater continued. The traffic outside grew louder. I sat quietly observing, trusting, underestimated. And in that quiet, I felt the weight of being invisible in plain sight. It was peaceful, almost comforting. I had my records. I had my observations. I had my restraint. That, I told myself, was enough. For now, the first time I noticed it, I almost dismissed it. My father had always been meticulous, precise in his routines, but that morning there was a subtle tension in the way he handled his documents. A paper left slightly askew on his desk. A folder half closed, the corners bent. I paused, hand hovering over my own stack of papers, sensing the faint disturbance in the air. It was easy to ignore, to chalk it up to fatigue or absent-mindedness. But something in the rhythm of the house felt off. Breakfast was the same as always, though my mother's glance lingered too long when my father spoke. She smiled politely at me, but there was a hesitation, a fraction of a second where her eyes seemed to search mine, as if trying to read a thought I hadn't shared. I noticed, and yet I said nothing. Trust had taught me to observe without comment, to catalog rather than confront. I moved through my morning as usual, coffee, notes, organizing the day, but the quiet discomfort lingered. A small incident in the study brought the first tangible unease. I found a document misplaced among my own files, something that had never belonged to me. I examined it, careful, noting the handwriting, the dates, the subtle annotations in the margins. Nothing overtly alarming, but the context was wrong. I set it aside, telling myself it was nothing, that it was probably an error. Mistakes happened. They had to happen. The house's rhythm could not always be perfect. Still, a small knot formed in my chest, a whisper of awareness that something might be amiss. At lunch, my father's tone carried a faint edge, almost imperceptible if one was not attuned. He spoke of mundane matters, appointments, errands, schedules, but the inflection betrayed impatience. I listened, silent, cataloging, noting the flicker of his eyes when he thought I wasn't paying attention. My mother, too, seemed strained, laughter a touch too high, movements a touch too precise. I sat quietly, finishing my meal, careful not to let the unease show. I had learned long ago that voicing suspicion often invited dismissal. Better to wait, to observe, to let patterns reveal themselves. Later, I noticed another small disruption. My father's briefcase, usually carefully arranged, had a corner sticking out awkwardly. I straightened it without comment, but my hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the quiet pressure of noticing. It was subtle, almost invisible, and I wondered if anyone else would see it. Most would have dismissed it as inconsequential. That was the advantage I carried, the patience to notice what others ignored. A call in the afternoon added to the discomfort. My father spoke softly, too softly, and my mother's reaction was delayed. I caught fragments of words, names, times, locations, but never the whole picture. There was a secrecy, a deliberate partiality that prickled at my awareness. I remained calm, my expression neutral, cataloging everything. My instinct told me something was beginning to shift, though nothing was yet certain. By evening, the house felt different. The silence was heavier, not peaceful as it had been in the early morning, but expectant, almost watchful. My mother lingered in the hallway, her eyes darting, her steps measured. My father closed his study door with a precision that seemed almost exaggerated. I moved through the house as if in a dream, noting these tiny irregularities, storing them in my memory. Each one alone meant little, but together they suggested a subtle fracture in the world I had trusted. Even as I prepared for bed, arranging my documents, checking schedules, and ensuring that every system was in order, I felt a quiet tension. I couldn't yet name it. I couldn't yet justify it. It was a shadow at the edge of my perception, small enough to ignore, persistent enough to unsettle. I reminded myself of the lesson I had learned long ago. The world often hides truth in plain sight, and only patience reveals it. I lay awake that night, listening to the faint hum of the heater, the distant traffic, the occasional creak of the house settling. Nothing seemed out of place if one looked casually. And yet the unease persisted. My routine, my systems, my observations, all reassured me that I was prepared, even if nothing yet demanded confrontation. The first seeds of doubt had been planted, subtle, almost invisible, but real. And I knew quietly that once doubt took root, trust would never be the same. The first undeniable sign appeared on a Thursday morning. My father's calendar had always been immaculate, each appointment, each meeting carefully noted and followed. That day, however, there was a discrepancy, a duplicate entry, a meeting scheduled that I had never seen mentioned before. It was subtle, the kind of detail easily overlooked by anyone but me. I stared at it for a moment, hands folded, resisting the impulse to confront. Observation first. Confirmation second. Reaction only if necessary. Later, while reviewing correspondence in my study, I noticed a series of emails that didn't align with previous patterns. Names I recognized, subjects that seemed routine, but the tone, the timing, the subtle omissions suggested something else, something concealed. I read each line carefully, noting what was present, what was absent. A missing acknowledgement here, a vague reference there. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was enough to make my chest tighten. The first red flag, an inconsistency I could not easily dismiss. At breakfast, the atmosphere was tense in a way that no one acknowledged. My mother's smile was clipped, my father's voice too measured. I watched the subtle gestures, the slight hesitation before he spoke, the way she avoided eye contact when mentioning certain names. I said nothing. I poured my coffee, took careful sips, and cataloged everything. My restraint was deliberate. People rarely notice quiet observation, and yet it often sees more than words or confrontation ever could. The first real moment of unease came that afternoon. I found a document tucked among my father's files, a statement I knew should not exist, a record of a meeting I had no knowledge of. The handwriting was unmistakably his, the signatures authentic, but the content suggested actions that contradicted what I had been told repeatedly. My hands remained steady as I set it aside. I did not react. I did not accuse. I only noted. The quiet power of observation had taught me that evidence, once fully understood, often speaks louder than confrontation ever could. By evening, the tension had accumulated. My father left his office abruptly, muttering about errands. I noticed the brief pause in his step as he passed my door, the faint glances exchanged between him and my mother. I cataloged each flicker, each shift. They assumed I did not see, that I could not perceive their subtleties. I allowed them this illusion. It was not deception, it was patience. They were planting seeds of a pattern I had already begun to recognize. That night, while organizing my own papers, I found another discrepancy, an account, slightly altered, a sum that did not reconcile. It was minor, almost insignificant, but it confirmed the pattern forming. Small inconsistencies, moments of omission, subtle deviations from the norm, each alone could be dismissed. Together, they created a quiet alarm I could not ignore. The first red flags were no longer ambiguous. They were emerging as something deliberate, something that demanded attention if I wanted to preserve clarity, trust, and integrity. I noticed, too, the changes in their behavior. My mother began to avoid certain topics, her laughter sharper when discussing ordinary matters, her gestures constrained. My father's voice, once commanding in its calm, carried a faint edge, a tension that betrayed restraint rather than anger. They were careful, deliberate, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy. But I observed, silently, cataloging each motion, each inflection. The quiet imbalance of power was beginning to reveal itself. Sleep offered no respite that night. I lay awake, reviewing the day in detail. The misplaced documents, the altered account, the hidden meetings, the hesitant glances. Each sign alone might have been inconsequential, but together they formed a constellation I could not unsee. The unease that had begun as a whisper in Chapter 2 had grown into a persistent murmur, a tension that pressed against my restraint. I reminded myself of the lesson I had learned early. Patience, observation, and careful documentation reveal more than confrontation. I did not yet act. I did not yet speak. But the first red flags had been raised, and I knew that from this point forward, trust was no longer absolute. I would watch, I would note, and I would wait for the patterns to become undeniable. In quiet observation, I found my power, even as the unease pressed deeper into the foundations of my life. The tension, once subtle, began to press against me openly, though no one acknowledged it. I had cataloged inconsistencies, noticed the red flags, and yet the house continued its outward appearance of normalcy. My father's questions became sharper, carefully crafted to unsettle, to make me doubt myself. "Did you check the figures properly?" he asked, though I had. His tone implied failure, a quiet accusation dressed as concern. I answered calmly, providing details, dates, references. He dismissed them with a casual wave as if my effort was invisible. My mother followed suit. She would smile sweetly, tilt her head, and make remarks that left me questioning my own memory. "Are you sure that's what happened?" She asked about meetings I had attended, statements I had read. Her words were measured, yet precise in their ability to sow doubt. I felt the subtle shift, the quiet undermining of trust, the gentle erosion of my certainty. It was as if my own perception was being challenged at every turn. I kept notes, silently, carefully. Observation became my shield. At dinner, the pattern became more pronounced. My father discussed financial matters with an air of authority, including details that contradicted the records I had kept meticulously. I pointed them out softly, careful not to provoke an argument, but he laughed it off, dismissing my observations as unnecessary attention to trivialities. My mother's laughter followed, warm but hollow, reinforcing the idea that I was overreacting, imagining discrepancies where none existed. Their dismissal was deliberate, a slow tightening of control. Later, while reviewing correspondence, I discovered another document that should have been accounted for in my records. I mentioned it casually to my father, expecting acknowledgement. Instead, he leaned back, a faint smirk crossing his face. "Are you sure you're looking at the right file?" he asked. My response was calm, precise. I had checked. Twice. He waved me off, and I felt the familiar weight of invisibility pressing down. They were gaslighting me subtly, shaping reality around my observations, bending perception without confrontation. The quiet escalation continued over the following days. Small comments, almost insignificant, became pressure points. "I thought you handled that last report," my father said, his tone layered with disbelief. "Perhaps you misread it," my mother suggested, eyes sympathetic, lips tight. I kept my composure, recording, remembering, noting. I could feel the psychological cost building, the slow wear of repeated dismissal, the erosion of self-confidence, the tension of being wronged without recourse. Yet I said nothing. My restraint was deliberate. I began to notice their reliance on witnesses, carefully placed allies in minor household matters. Servants, neighbors, colleagues, they repeated phrases, reinforced narratives, all subtly designed to undermine my perspective. "He mentioned it differently to me," one would say. "I thought that was your understanding too," another added. I cataloged these statements silently, recognizing the orchestration. They assumed my quiet presence meant weakness, that I would not cross-examine the layers of influence around me. They were mistaken. Even at night, when the house seemed empty, I felt their influence lingering. Doors left slightly ajar, papers shuffled when I was away, subtle misalignments in the records I trusted. The gaslighting was pervasive but elegant. They did not shout, they did not confront. They simply wove doubt, bending reality gently around my perception. I noticed each instance, marking mental notes with precision. The quiet cruelty was heavier than any open confrontation I had imagined. It demanded constant vigilance. I realized with a quiet, cold clarity that I could not rely on trust alone. The patterns were deliberate and the dismissal was systematic. I was being trained to doubt, subtly, patiently, and in ways that left no trace for outsiders to notice. My restraint became both shield and tool. I observed, I cataloged, I prepared. The power imbalance was clear. They assumed authority, assumed control, assumed that my silence equaled submission. But I knew that observation was a slow, steady force. By the end of the week, I felt the psychological weight of their manipulation in my bones. My confidence wavered, not because the evidence was uncertain, but because their dismissal was constant. Each day required careful self-regulation, each interaction a calculated response. And yet, beneath it all, a quiet certainty grew. Patterns, once small and easily ignored, were now unmistakable. The gaslighting and dismissal, however sophisticated, had revealed more than they intended. I was watching, I was remembering, and I was preparing for the truth to assert itself. The first cracks appeared almost by accident. A routine check of the house's records, files I had meticulously maintained, revealed a discrepancy I could not ignore. A ledger, previously balanced, now contained entries that did not match any of the documented meetings or correspondence. My hands moved automatically, tracing numbers, comparing dates, aligning signatures. The evidence was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable. Someone had been inserting their own narrative into what had always been precise. I didn't react immediately. Patience, I had learned, was more effective than confrontation. I began to catalog everything I had noticed. Misplaced documents, altered statements, irregular accounts, the hesitant glances my parents exchanged when they thought I wasn't watching. Each instance was small, almost inconsequential in isolation. But together, they formed a pattern, a quiet testimony to deception that was beginning to reveal itself despite their careful orchestration. That afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor, a distant colleague of my father's, someone who had handled confidential correspondence in the past. They mentioned, casually, an irregularity in a meeting schedule, something my father had explained differently. The words were innocent enough, framed as conversation, but to me they were confirmation. I listened quietly, recording every detail in my mind. The witness had no knowledge of my suspicions, yet inadvertently, they validated them. The first external hint that the betrayal was real. Later, I checked the email system. Hidden threads emerged, messages carefully deleted from the inbox, drafts never sent but still accessible in archives, hints of communication that contradicted the version my father had given me. I felt a tightening in my chest, a mix of frustration and grim satisfaction. The truth, once hidden beneath layers of manipulation and dismissal, was beginning to leak through cracks they hadn't anticipated. Systems I trusted were revealing what words could not. At dinner, my father's composure remained unshaken, though I noticed a subtle shift in his usual cadence. My mother laughed a little too brightly, gestures slightly exaggerated. They were unaware that I had begun to piece together the inconsistencies. I stayed calm, quiet, eating mechanically, observing carefully. The balance of power, so carefully maintained by gaslighting and dismissal, had begun to tilt, imperceptibly, in my favor. Not through confrontation, but through the slow, relentless accumulation of truth. The following morning brought another confirmation. I found correspondence between my father and a business associate, carefully hidden among unrelated files. The language was familiar, the signatures authentic, yet the content was deliberate misdirection. They assumed the casual observer would accept surface appearances. They assumed I would remain dismissible, quiet, ineffective. I allowed them their illusion. I cataloged everything, careful to preserve the integrity of evidence and context. Each fragment became a testament to the deception, a thread of truth that no manipulation could erase. By midday, I encountered a secondary witness. A neighbor, unaware of the full situation, mentioned noticing unusual activity at the house, visitors at odd hours, conversations overheard through thin walls. Innocent remarks, casually delivered, but to me they were pieces of a larger puzzle. I recorded the details with precision, noting dates, times, and subtle context. These external confirmations, however indirect, were critical. They showed that the pattern extended beyond the household, beyond controlled environments, and that the truth was slowly escaping the confines my father had attempted to contain. Even as I reviewed the growing mountain of evidence, I remained outwardly calm. No words escaped my lips. My hands were steady, my expression neutral. The power of quiet observation was in restraint. Each new discovery, each small exposure, reinforced a principle I had always believed. Truth, if pursued methodically, eventually surfaces. I had no need for confrontation yet. My goal was clarity, accumulation, the patient gathering of facts that would one day leave no room for dispute. By evening, the subtle fractures in my father's careful control were impossible to ignore. The ledger, correspondence, witness statements, and system anomalies collectively painted a picture he could not fully erase. Yet he remained composed, unaware that his carefully constructed facade was beginning to collapse, one unnoticed inconsistency at a time. The partial exposure had begun, a quiet, unstoppable revelation that required no speech, no dramatic confrontation, only patience, observation, and meticulous attention to detail. As I lay awake that night, I reviewed everything in my mind. Patterns, anomalies, subtle confirmations, small witnesses to the truth. The psychological weight of knowing more than they did was profound. I understood the gravity of the situation, the quiet tension of watching betrayal unfold without acknowledgement, without external recognition. I also understood that exposure, partial as it was the first step toward reclaiming the clarity and power that had always been mine quietly, through observation and restraint. The subtle cracks had widened into visible fissures, though no one openly acknowledged them. My father had begun to sense that I noticed more than I should. The careful control he had maintained for so long now wavered, though he hid it behind a veneer of composure. I observed him closely, cataloging every slight hesitation, every small inflection, every gesture that betrayed tension. The house itself seemed to reflect it, a quiet tightness, a sense of waiting, as if it too were holding its breath. It began with a misdirected remark. He mentioned a meeting I had no knowledge of, expecting my compliance, my ignorance. I responded calmly, referencing the documents I had collected, the schedules I had meticulously maintained. His eyes flickered, a momentary lapse before the practiced calm returned. He smiled thinly, a gesture meant to reassure, but I recognized it for what it was, recognition that the balance was shifting. He knew I had begun to see. My mother's behavior intensified alongside his. Subtle manipulations that had once been minor now carried an edge. She questioned my recollections more aggressively, repeated false information with greater insistence. At first, I cataloged the incident silently, making no reaction. But the pattern was unmistakable. My awareness was forcing them into more overt measures. Gaslighting, which had been careful and measured, was now deliberate escalation. A critical moment came when a family acquaintance visited unexpectedly. My father, unaware that I had already reviewed the relevant records, attempted to assert his version of recent events. I remained silent, letting the conversation unfold while mentally cross-referencing each claim with the evidence I had compiled. The acquaintance, unaware of the subtext, commented on minor inconsistencies themselves. I noted every word, the timing, the glances exchanged. My father's composure flickered imperceptibly. The quiet, restrained observation I had relied on was now my most effective shield. Later that day, I discovered another document, hidden among routine correspondence, a signed statement contradicting prior claims, carefully backdated. The intention was obvious. They believed I would accept the fabricated version or dismiss it as a clerical error. Instead, I cataloged it, compared it with prior records, and noted every anomaly. Each attempt at manipulation now added weight to the evidence against them. The escalation was both reckless and revealing. By evening, the tension had become palpable. My father's movements were sharper, more deliberate. He monitored my actions with a subtle intensity, asking questions not to gather information but to test my awareness. My mother mirrored the behavior, her laughter now brittle, her gestures overly precise. They assumed my silence signaled uncertainty, that restraint indicated submission. They were wrong. I had learned that the quietest observer often held the greatest clarity, and clarity was power. The psychological cost was not trivial. I felt the strain of constant vigilance pressing against my mind. Every interaction required measured attention, every word chosen with precision. I cataloged details that would later serve as evidence, noting inconsistencies, recording behavior patterns, and observing their attempts at concealment. The weight of knowing more than they suspected was heavy, but it was necessary. In this slow burn struggle, patience and careful observation were my only tools. A confrontation, though unspoken, became inevitable in its subtlety. My father attempted a private discussion, the kind designed to intimidate without witnesses. I maintained calm, referencing facts without accusation, letting the data speak quietly for itself. He tried to assert authority through tone and implication, but the facts could not be dismissed. My restraint contrasted sharply with his agitation. His power relied on assumption, My strength relied on clarity. The escalation had reached a point where their attempts at control only exposed more of the truth. I noticed the effects on the household. Servants, neighbors, colleagues, all began to act differently, sensing the tension, noticing that the careful narrative my father had maintained was unraveling. Witnesses, once casual, now became inadvertent allies in revealing the pattern of deception. The quiet accumulation of facts, the meticulous observation, the patient documentation, all were converging. They assumed escalation would intimidate me, that increased pressure would force compliance. Instead, it illuminated the depth of their deception. Even as the days passed, the escalation continued. My father's controlled aggression grew, my mother's manipulations became sharper, and yet each move added to the evidence I held. Systems I had trusted, from ledgers to correspondence to third-party observations, were quietly exposing the truth. The balance of power, long assumed to favor them, was tilting. And I, who had been underestimated, dismissed, and carefully observed by them, now held the advantage without needing to speak. By night, I lay awake, reviewing every subtle move, every hidden document, every inadvertent confirmation of deceit. The weight of escalation was heavy, but so was the satisfaction of clarity. They had assumed that intimidation and manipulation could control reality. I knew better. Observation, patience, and careful recording revealed truth that no amount of aggression could obscure. The escalation was their mistake, and it would prove to be their undoing, not through spectacle, not through confrontation, but through the quiet, relentless emergence of evidence that could not be denied. By the time I reached that point, the weight of awareness had become nearly unbearable. Every interaction, every gesture, every carefully constructed lie had accumulated into a quiet, relentless pressure. I understood the full scope of their deception, and yet there was no relief in revelation, only a steady recognition of the cost. I felt the familiar pull of restraint, the need to observe without reaction, to document without accusation, to measure every word against the evidence I held. That morning, I noticed my father handling correspondence with a carelessness that betrayed his fatigue. The documents were no longer shuffled with subtlety but placed in clear view, as if daring me to notice. I did. I cataloged every anomaly, comparing them against prior records, tracing patterns of deceit I had already begun to outline in my mind. It was exhausting, a psychological strain that tightened with every observation. Each record, each witness statement, each slip became a silent proof of betrayal. My mother was equally meticulous in her subtlety. Her conversations carried layers of manipulation, testing my perception, eroding my confidence through carefully worded remarks. I responded only with neutrality, letting the evidence accumulate. I felt the strain in my chest, the mental weight of constant vigilance, yet I did not falter. Observation had always been my strength, but now it was also my burden. Every small lie, every half-truth, every effort to rewrite reality pressed against my sense of morality and endurance. There were moments when the temptation to react was overwhelming, to confront, to expose, to demand acknowledgement, but I resisted. I understood that action without preparation would diminish the quiet power I had cultivated. My restraint became almost physical, a constant, conscious choice to remain calm even when my mind screamed for release. I cataloged every word, every gesture, every subtle shift in their behavior, understanding that patience now would yield clarity and consequence later. A particularly painful moment occurred when my father called me into his study under the guise of discussion. He questioned my recollection of a series of meetings, attempting to frame my notes as flawed, my understanding incomplete. I responded calmly, referencing precise dates, times, and documented interactions. He waved my evidence aside, smiling thinly, dismissing the clarity I presented. It was infuriating, yet I contained myself. Every flicker of irritation or doubt in me would have been the victory he sought. I did not give it. Later, I discovered another ledger anomaly. The numbers, the dates, the signatures, they all confirmed the narrative I had begun to piece together. I could have confronted him immediately, laid out every piece, and forced recognition. But I chose not to. My moral and emotional breaking point was not about reaction. It was about understanding the cost of knowledge. I realized that restraint, though painful, was the more powerful response. Acting impulsively would have offered temporary satisfaction, but observation and patience carried lasting consequence. By evening, the psychological weight had become almost a tangible presence in the house. I moved through rooms carefully, noting the tense air, the subtle avoidance in my mother's gestures, the sharp glances my father exchanged with household staff. They assumed my silence meant weakness, that the quiet endurance of observation equaled ignorance. I had learned, painfully, that the strongest truths are often revealed without confrontation. They assumed control, yet every act of escalation only reinforced the evidence I quietly collected. I realized that my own restraint carried a cost. The emotional toll was heavy: sleepless nights, persistent anxiety, and the constant calculation of my movements and words. Yet within that cost, I also found clarity. Betrayal had been revealed not through confrontation, but through meticulous observation and careful preservation of evidence. My moral breaking point was not the loss of composure, but the acceptance of the quiet inevitability of truth. I could see the consequences forming even as I withheld judgment. That night, as I reviewed the day's findings, I understood that I had reached a turning point. The truth was undeniable, the web of deception fully apparent, and yet I had not spoken, had not confronted, had not demanded recognition. I had achieved what I needed through patience, careful documentation, and unbroken restraint. The cost was my emotional endurance, my sleepless reflection, and the quiet knowledge that betrayal, even fully revealed, leaves no immediate relief. By the end of the evening, I allowed myself a rare moment of introspection. The breaking point had arrived, not in action, not in words, not in confrontation, but in the full recognition of reality. I accepted the betrayal, the manipulation, the subtle cruelty, and the weight of observation that had become my constant companion. My restraint was deliberate, my understanding complete, and my preparation for the inevitable consequences thorough. I lay awake, knowing that the next phase, consequences, was approaching, and that the quiet power I had cultivated would soon assert itself, not through speech, not through dramatics, but through the relentless truth of evidence and observation. The culmination of careful observation, documentation, and restraint began to manifest quietly, almost imperceptibly, yet undeniably. The first signs appeared in small ways: a ledger that could no longer be explained away, correspondence that contradicted repeated assurances, and witnesses who, without meaning to, confirmed what had long been hidden. The house, once a stage for subtle manipulation, now seemed to contract under the weight of revealed truths. My father's composure had begun to falter. He no longer spoke with the same controlled confidence, and the slight tremor in his voice betrayed his awareness that his manipulation could no longer hold. I observed him as I always had, noting his careful attempts to regain control through silence or deflection. But each misstep, each subtle error, only reinforced the truth that had been quietly gathering over months. The balance of power had shifted, almost imperceptibly, from him to me, and I did not need to speak to assert it. My mother's behavior mirrored his unease. The gestures that had once seemed carefully calculated now felt strained, as if maintaining the illusion had become a performance she could no longer sustain. Her laughter, once hollow but precise, now sounded forced even to casual observers. The network of subtle gaslighting, the whispers to neighbors, the orchestrated distractions, all were unraveling without confrontation, merely through the patient accumulation of evidence and observation. A key moment occurred when an associate of my father visited unexpectedly. Documents they carried, intended to reinforce my father's version of events, inadvertently confirmed the discrepancies I had catalogued. I remained calm, silent, allowing the facts to speak for themselves. The associate left, unaware that their presence had exposed additional inconsistencies. My restraint magnified the consequences. The more they tried to assert control, the more the truth became apparent. By midweek, the systems my father had relied upon to maintain authority, ledgers, correspondence, schedules, and third-party confirmations, were acting as instruments of exposure. I reviewed each one carefully, comparing and cross-referencing, noting discrepancies with precision. Every attempt at manipulation, every fabricated entry, every subtle line now served to confirm the larger picture. The consequences were inevitable. The truth required no dramatic confrontation to assert itself. The psychological weight on my father became more apparent. Small irritations, a slight impatience, and the tension in his posture all spoke louder than words. I watched quietly as he attempted to regain composure, to reestablish control through subtle commands and manipulations, yet the evidence I had accumulated rendered such efforts hollow. He had underestimated my capacity for observation and documentation. The consequences were not public, not dramatic, but methodical and inescapable. My mother's realization followed a similar arc. Her carefully maintained narrative, designed to protect herself and reinforce my father's authority, began to crumble as I quietly presented facts through indirect measures, documents, records, and witnesses who corroborated the truth without my intervention. The psychological pressure, once applied to me through gaslighting, now reflected back upon them. The very tools they had used to assert dominance had become instruments of accountability. By evening, the quiet consequences became unmistakable. Meetings that had previously been unquestioned were now scrutinized by others. Statements once taken at face value were now challenged. The invisible threads of power, carefully woven over years, were unraveling systematically. I did not need to speak. The systems I had monitored, the evidence I had preserved, and the patience I had exercised were sufficient to ensure that truth was undeniable. I felt no satisfaction, no triumph, only a solemn recognition of what had been achieved. The consequences were real, profound, and yet understated. My father's authority had diminished, my mother's manipulations were ineffective, and the subtle injustices they had maintained were exposed to reality, not spectacle. The outcome was not a victory in the conventional sense, but a quiet, irrevocable acknowledgement of truth. That night, I reflected on the months of restraint, observation, and careful accumulation of evidence. The consequences had unfolded exactly as they should, not through confrontation, not through spectacle, but through patience, clarity, and the unerring logic of documented truth. The weight of betrayal remained, but the cost to the deceivers was unavoidable. In silence, the quiet aftermath had begun, and the house, once a theater of manipulation, now settled into a tense, truthful stillness. The house was quieter than it had been in months. Not peaceful, exactly, but heavy with a stillness that carried the weight of unspoken truths. My father no longer moved with the same assured authority. His presence was smaller, contained. My mother, once the orchestrator of subtle manipulation, now carried a measured tension in every gesture. They had not been confronted in anger, had not been humiliated publicly, and yet the consequences of their actions were undeniable. I moved through the rooms with deliberate calm, cataloging one final time the evidence, the records, the subtle confirmations that had led to this moment. Everything was in order, everything bore witness to the truth. The documents, the emails, the ledger entries, even the incidental remarks of witnesses, all spoke without words. Their power, once wielded to distort reality, now lay diminished beneath the quiet weight of clarity. No one celebrated. No one acknowledged the shift. There was no victory in my voice, no triumph in my expression. I had learned long ago that revelation does not require spectacle. The aftermath was calm, heavy, inevitable. The truth, once partial, had fully emerged, and the deceivers had no choice but to live within its shadow. I felt a mixture of exhaustion and clarity. The months of restraint, observation, and meticulous attention had carried their cost, both emotional and psychological. Yet in that weight, there was a measure of quiet strength. I had maintained my composure, honored the truth, and allowed consequences to unfold without interference. That alone was enough. As I sat by the window, looking out at the fading light, I realized that the story had ended not in confrontation or vindication, but in acknowledgement, silent, undeniable, and unadorned. There was no applause, no recognition, no dramatics. Just the quiet aftermath, heavy and complete, a testament to the slow, patient emergence of truth and the subtle, unyielding power of restraint.